few days ago, I stumbled upon like a picture, I think a few days after I got my first computer. It's like 6-year-old me at a computer. When I was 13, I started getting very curious about how things actually work and how can I make something do something that it wasn't intended to do, like how I can subvert programs into doing other things. So I think that's like the first memory I have from like doing something shady. It got shadier from that point. I have weird hobbies. My hobby is I go to Micro Center and I buy a bunch of like routers and cameras and whatever, and I take them home and I tear them apart and I find exploits in them. Like, that's my hobby. And some things, you know, it takes me literally 10 minutes, and some things takes me months. Depends on how bad of a job the vendor did when they made the product. Some things are staggering, like staggeringly bad. Some people are doing average job, which is like, good for you, average is better than nothing. But the majority of the things is pretty horrendous. I don't think that security is something that you can learn from a book. You have to try things yourself. You have to try to break things yourself. There's a lot of ingenuity and a lot of practicality to things. It has to be curiosity. It has to be discipline to like sit down and figure something out and not to give up.
I think a good defender has to understand risk. That defender needs to understand how things work, needs to understand what the real risks are and be able to separate the wheat from the chaff.
As a defender, you're always on the disadvantage side of things because an attacker only has to be successful once. Being a defender is sort of like the dam with the holes in it that you always have to figure out which hole you need to plug with your finger next.
I think it's going to take, unfortunately, this event that the three-letter agency people call the Cyber 9/11 or the Cyber Pearl Harbor before things can change. And I used to think that even mentioning those words, the Cyber Pearl Harbor, Cyber 9/11, was just overhyping and scaring readers. Now I think it's not that far off.
For the most part, it's kind of the silent sentry type thing. You're on the wall every day doing your job, and if you're doing it well, things shouldn't go wrong. And it's really hard to have the unsung story for the people who do their job well, and that means business as usual continues.
Right now, we're the guinea pigs. It's only been in the last 10, 20 years that we've seen the real destruction and damage of what hackers can do. In terms of stealing our intellectual property, in terms of freedom of the press, in terms of potentially shutting down our critical infrastructure.
Muni hacked the cyber attack that is giving passengers free rides all over San Francisco.
How much did they want?
They want about $73,000 or 100 Bitcoin.
Did you pay?
We have never considered paying the ransom, and nor do we intend to pay it.
I think it's terrifying. I really do. If they can start doing this, here, we're not safe anywhere.
The day after Thanksgiving, I was sitting in my family room, quite happy and content after having a bunch of people in my home the day before, when an email flashed across my notifications saying, "I think you should be on this thread." They were having problems in communicating amongst themselves about not being able to connect to certain services. As I read through it, I knew immediately we had a problem. It was a holiday weekend, so the reason we weren't here was because of that, but the MTA runs 7/24, so we had field operations, we had service running, we had the control center in, so we knew we had to move fast to ensure that we can maintain services for the organization and for the city.
There was no intent initially for the hackers to target San Francisco's light rail system. In fact, they were just targeting the internet. And San Francisco's light rail system happened to be on the list very, very high up. So it was one of the very first systems that was targeted and unfortunately was vulnerable.
Usually ransomware attacks, it's a way to make money. Think about like an online mafia.
What used to be very trivial, almost prankster style attacks have changed immensely as a lot of these criminal organizations have shifted and matured. These attacks for financial advantage are really is what's coming to pass.
The first decision I made is disconnecting the fare gates and places where we were interacting with the public's information. In a lot of ways, the ridership thought we were being nice and just giving free muni for the day after Thanksgiving. We had our priorities already. They're well defined. We really looked at it incrementally. It's like we were making sure that the field personnel were well taken care of, that they didn't have to maintain their manual processes anymore, that we could bring them back to automated processes as soon as possible in a safe way. That was that first day. By the end of Friday, we felt pretty comfortable that we were going to be able to resolve all the issues, and Monday morning, people were going to be able to come into work and do their jobs. It did give the team a lot of credibility in the way they handled it and how quickly they restored. We had several cocktails to celebrate the restoration and, more importantly, that we were done. If you can build it, it can be hacked, period. End of discussion. There is nothing that is 100% fail-safe. There is no technology that is going to 100% secure something from a vulnerability if somebody wants to get at it, except for turning it off, and we can't turn it off.
People who are really good in this field tend to not know how to translate it outside of the tech speak. And that is really the biggest deficiency I see for cybersecurity and the Defender in general is they're too good at their job in a way.
You are essentially at your core extremely curious about the world.
People that they are creative and their mind is not just going on one thing, another one thing, another one thing. It's actually their mind can think about many things and can be creative, and they're looking for how that thing can work differently. How can I change it and morph it in order to achieve a different result?
It is a race for ownership and control, a back and forth, spy versus spy. And I don't think the media has done enough really to highlight the defenders.
So I find that life is really nonlinear. If you look at the course of my life, I've been a winemaker, I've been an engineer, I've been a doctor, I'm a farmer, and I never know what tomorrow is going to bring. And so this is why I get up every morning, because there's just so much to do in life.
I think the earliest hack that I've seen was one of mine. Very simply put, in the 10th or 11th grade for our biology test, we were allowed to bring a 3x5 card with any notes you can. I went into the computer lab. We had a little box Max, and I spent hours there typing in the font number 2, I think the smallest font I can possibly read without magnifying glass. I fit 35 type pages on this 3x5 card, and the teacher said that because it was so ingenious for the time, she allowed me to bring that 3x5 card with me to the exam.
I'm actually a historian by background. As a historian, I actually got very interested in, I studied military history, war studies, and got interested in the release of new material that was coming into the public domain out of the intelligence agencies.
Really in grade school started to hook up computers to the school network, unbeknownst to them. And really the first time I found a bulletin board system or connected to another computer, that was like finding another world for me.
Right on my eye level, beyond the candy, was a big red button at the grocery store. And I remember seeing it said on and it said off. And I remember pushing that button or that switch. It was a red switch. And then I started to hear chatter. A woman who was ringing up groceries said, "Hey, my system is off." And then she called over to the next lane. "Yeah, my system's off as well." And I think that was probably the first time that I sort of put two and two together from like a real cause and effect around a technology. There's a button and a switch that can cause like this mass outage at a grocery store.
My wife and I put together Unity Farm as really a place for organic agriculture. We've been vegans for 22 years, so we grow our own food. But also, some of it was about bringing on some animals that we would treat very humanely. I mean, we don't eat them or their products. We brought on some chickens and ducks and geese, alpacas and llamas.
I grew up in the Soviet Union where, there are 4 or 5 coins and that's it. My approach to collecting coins was always finding something unusual, but not buying coins, actually finding things. The process itself I find fascinating, uncovering something unusual.
I got very interested in the use of technology, the development of early computers in terms of cracking codes and cryptography. And so that's where my sort of interest started, really.
The minutes of the April 1955 meeting of MIT's Tech Model Railroad Club included the sentence, "Mr. Echoes requests that anyone working or hacking on the electrical system turn the power off to avoid fuse blowing." This word was coined to describe any sort of fussing with machines. However, it can be used to describe events that happened before 1955. In 1903, English magician Neville Maskelyne hacked a public demonstration of Marconi's wireless telegraph machine to try to disprove the security of the technology. In 1945, French computer expert René Carmille hacked and reprogrammed the Nazi punch card census system so that there wouldn't be any mark in column 11, which denoted religion, saving untold numbers of Jewish people from the Nazi death camps. In 1957, a blind 7-year-old with perfect pitch discovered that whistling the 4th E above middle C would interfere with AT&T's phone system, allowing him to make free phone calls. He later got into trouble in college when he started charging classmates $1 to whistle into their phones. In 1971, this telephone hacking, better known as phreaking, became well known after an article on hacker Captain Crunch ran in Esquire magazine. Early fans of the Captain were Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, about whom you could fill in the rest. In 1981, the Chaos Computer Club formed in Germany. It has since become Europe's largest association of hackers. 1 year later, a group calling themselves the 414s broke into the computer systems of dozens of companies, including the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and Securities Pacific Bank. The group was made up of mostly teenagers. In 1984, William Gibson published his book Neuromancer, about a washed-up hacker, which popularized such phrases as cyberspace, the Matrix, and ICE. Also, this happened. We shall prevail. And after that, the floodgates were open. The Morris worm, the Father Christmas worm, AOL, the Anna Kournikova virus, WannaCry, Anonymous, WikiLeaks, and a bunch of movies starring Keanu Reeves. Whoa! In the interest of keeping things moving, here's how many Americans had their identities stolen last year. Here's how many businesses were the victim of some kind of hack in the past 12 months. And here's how many people and companies in the world who are not susceptible to being hacked.
There is no war today that you're not going to use cyber. I believe, this is a cookbook part of the way. You don't need to send spies anymore, you can use cyber.
The next war will be fought without a single bullet being fired. The next war will start with country A shutting down the power grid in country B.
A lot of the countries that are coming to power now or are having more global interests now than they ever did before are seeing it as the economical way to kind of leapfrog the stack.
What once was a situation where you had maybe 5 countries that could pull off a cyber attack of real destruction. It was the United States, it was Israel, it was the UK, it was Russia, it was China. But in that group, no one really had the motivation or incentive to pull off that attack. The world was still globalized. Maybe we were seeing a lot of hacking activity from China, but at the end of the day, they're one of the US's biggest bankers. They were never going to pull off an attack that was going to seriously damage US economic interests. But then you had this other group of actors, and in that group, you would put North Korea, you would put Iran, and then nameless, faceless hacktivists, political activists everywhere else, and cyber criminals who might want to actually pull off an attack that would set back US economic interests, but they didn't necessarily have the skills to do so. So what's changed over the last 5-6 years is those groups are actually gaining the skills to do so, and that's where we are now.
They've been around for a very long time. The world just really didn't care that much about it. They started out doing your hacking for profit against like World of Warcraft communities and primarily against South Korea. It was a way to generate currency for a regime that was starved by sanctions. They didn't really understand the full potential of it until they started seeing a lot of the news and press and that kind of stuff that it garnered from the other quote-unquote big players. And then they kind of realized, hey, this is an untapped potential for doing other things as well.
The North Koreans, they worry me in a different way, and it's because they have a very capable offensive cyber unit, and they also have the intent to use cyber when tensions start to escalate in other areas of the world or in other domains. And so the nightmare scenario there is that they decide to reach out and touch the United States to do something destructive on critical infrastructure. And because of the way escalation works right there with other aspects of military force, the U.S. could find itself kind of handcuffed and not really have a very good response.
Kim Jong-un took power and things changed. He's a touchy little guy. And he got really pissed off about the interview.
Hate us because they ain't us. Exactly. They hate us because they ain't us.
That's really when they springboarded from this minor nuisance that was kind of a regional player to this international stage.
Kim! You got it, boy! Okay. Alley-oop! Oh! Sorry. Oh, my ankles.
The Sony cyber attack was interesting because we first saw indications of it not in intelligence at all. You know, it was not in any of the daily intelligence products that I would read when I first got in there. It was in snippets of the news where on Twitter or other tech media outlets, there were reports of Sony maybe getting hacked. And at that point in my job in the Department of Defense, it didn't really register as something to be concerned about.
If you did try to do this, what would kill you first? Sub-freezing temperatures.
I don't like the cold.
Okay,
Starvation. Starve to death.
You tell me the CIA doesn't have North Face jackets and some pirate booty?
It was about 3 or 4 days, I think, after the hack really became evident that it became more clear that this almost certainly was the North Koreans, which then puts the US government in a really difficult situation, right? Remember, this was the first destructive cyber attack against the United States ever. That's a pretty significant thing. And it would be one thing if it were a destructive cyber attack and it were against a target where you could easily say that's something that's an attack on the country, like the energy grid or a hospital or a bank. But it wasn't. It was against the media sector, and it was against Sony Pictures, which was making this crazy movie. And so there's a question about, even if it were the North Koreans, is it appropriate for the US government, more or less the Department of Defense, to respond to an attack on a motion picture producer like that? It makes it more complicated. Then when you think, okay, it is the North Koreans, and you decide what they're doing is attacking something that is dear to the United States and the Constitution and the First Amendment, what is the right response?
We spent a lot of time thinking about what is the right types of responses, how do we manage this, and then the DHS folks mostly focused on getting our hands around what actually happened, what's the technical information that we can take and then share with the rest of the community.
I can remember, I think it was Christmas Eve day, standing outside the White House for another one of these meetings because we're getting to the final series of meetings about what we were going to do and what we were going to announce. And on the one hand, it's kind of exciting because it's the first time it's ever happened. You're one of the cyber policy people in the government at a senior level, and it's interesting. On the other hand, you think like, who knows whether that was just the first of more attacks to come? And if we make the wrong decision about how to deter North Korea,
Is it going to result in a broader conflict? Are they going to cyber attack critical infrastructure? Do they have malware already in place in the grid? Always a little stressful when you're thinking about all the things that could happen. I think the way it eventually came out that there was a public attribution by the FBI and the Department of Justice. We leveled sanctions and then did some other things, small cyber things, to try to show the North Koreans that this wasn't the right course of action for them, just because Kim Jong-un was upset that there was a movie in which, you know, his head was blowing up. I didn't even see the movie. I watched it for like 5 minutes and it wasn't even a good movie. I think one of the most important lessons is that attribution is really important, and doing public attribution is really important too, that you have to think consciously about that. Another important lesson is that although it was a cyber attack, our response was almost entirely not cyber. So when you're a senior policymaker, you need to internalize very quickly that you need to use all the national security foreign policy tools in your kit bag. I think also that learning more about the way Sony responded to the attack by the North Koreans, they were a very good example of a very poorly run cybersecurity operation in the private sector. No incident response plan, you know, no data backup. So a lesson that I hope private sector folks learn is you do not want to be the CEO of a firm that just got hacked and you don't know what you're doing, all of your machines are down, you're trying to respond to an international crisis with paper and pencil because none of your networks work. That doesn't seem like a good place to be.
We're all part of a global ecosystem that depends upon each of us managing our individual cyber risk very well, but it also depends on people and organizations understanding national risk.
What really closed the gap between the US and some of those interests happened just a year ago when some of the NSA's own tools and CIA's own tools were dumped out on the web. So some of the very tools that we use that were really sophisticated, that were being used by our own national interests to hack into whoever, were suddenly available on the internet for anyone to pick up and use on a target of their interest.
The potential for damage is pretty spectacular, actually. We haven't even scratched the surface. Nuclear plants, power grids, water grids. In fact, when a nuclear plant goes down, just, we don't know why it went down, this is a technical flaw, or a power grid goes down, or when an airport loses power, the first question we should ask is, was that incompetence or a mistake or unexpected event, or was it malicious?